role of national politics. I mean, that is sometimes forgotten when you sort of look upon the various aspects of the European Parliament election. We now move on. Well, I mean, you've almost already been presented. I was going to say the Queen of Italy, Nathalie Tocci. I don't think you need any kind of introduction because Mitch just gave you one. But I think if you look upon your various sort of publications recently, I was struck that you had the following sort of quote that I found, that going back to when the Berlin Wall fell in '89, Europe stood for direction. We thought the world was headed. That was us. We sort of set the direction. Now the world is closing up. How does Europe survive when the tide is going in the opposite direction? I think that is a very good question. So we'd obviously like to hear what's the answer to that, but also how this ties in with the overall green agenda, which is one of the topics of your most recent book, which you should read, obviously. So, Nathalie Tocci, among many things, you are the head of the Italian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. And in fact, unlike Midge, I come to Copenhagen actually quite a lot. I was here 3 days ago to spend an absolutely delightful weekend with my son. And so I love the city so much that here I am back after 3 days. So what I wanted to do is really sort of use my time here to touch on many of the issues, Lika, that you were mentioning, and in a sense kind of use this climate story as a thread to, I think, paint a broader story about where we were, where we are, where we're headed, and how to avoid continuing on where we're headed, which connects to many of the points that Mish was making. And I think, you can tell actually quite a neat story by looking at it through that sort of climate lens, or Europe climate lens. So I would say that, if we sort of rewind back 5 years ago, around about this time, elections were coming up, and that was, in a sense, a moment of enlightenment. And why was it a moment of enlightenment? It was a moment of enlightenment because, frankly speaking, the EU, Europe more broadly, had really been coming out of pretty much, a decade and a half of hopping from one existential crisis to the next. And hopping from one existential crisis to the next really without a compass, really without a sense of direction. And by the time we get to 2019, essentially, the climate story, and in particular the green agenda, which then eventually becomes the Green Deal, really ends up doing various things at the same time. The first and most obvious, the EU picks as its #1 priority the existential crisis. No one disputes this, perhaps slightly more now than then, but I'll come to this later on. But back then, it was really motherhood and apple pie, right? Everyone knew that this was the good thing to do, right? Because it was existential. At the same time, it was not just existential, it was also deeply political. And it was deeply political in a way that the EU really needed at that time. Again, particularly as a result of the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, the EU really had been going through years of being increasingly viewed as grey, detached, bureaucratic, and really distanced from the concerns of ordinary citizens. What does it end up doing? It ends up picking up the one issue, not only that citizens care about, but in particular youth cares about, right? So it was really this incredible way of actually reconnecting, not being grey anymore, but actually being green, and by being green, reconnecting to the #1 priority that citizens, and in particular youth, cared about. And of course, this was coming on the heels of the European Parliament elections in 2019, which, as we know, saw a very strong showing of Green parties. So it served #1, an existential goal, #2, a political goal. Number three, an economic goal. So this was the time in which we all of a sudden realized that actually moving forward on decarbonization did not have to be a degrowth strategy. It actually meant a growth strategy because CO2 emissions and growth could actually be decoupled. And so again, you know, sort of thinking about the image of the EU as an EU of constraint, of restraint, of austerity, all of a sudden, the EU became seen as potentially a project for construction, for innovation, for growth. And then finally, and this I think became increasingly obvious in a moment that I'll get to in a second, this was also a strategic project. Why was it as a strategic project? Well, it was already clear back then that terms like strategic autonomy were becoming increasingly important. And of course, if you think about what the meaning of strategic autonomy in an area like energy and climate, in a continent that, as we know, does not produce fossil fuels, or not a lot of fossil fuels, and certainly imports far more than what it exports, latching on to the green agenda also made strategic sense. So this was really bingo, right? I mean, here the EU sort of finds a compass once again to essentially reconnect to citizens, to pursue a strategic agenda, and this is where we were, so a moment of enlightenment. Then actually comes, I think, the even more interesting moment, which I would define as the Monetian moment. As probably most, if not all of you know, a wonderful citation from Jean Monnet in his memoirs, about the EU being the sum of the solutions of the crises it will face. Now, in a sense, in that decade and a half previously that I was mentioning, the EU had really lost its Monetian way of doing things. Yes, of course, it had addressed the Eurozone crisis, migration, frankly speaking, not particularly well, as we all know. However, what it ended up doing after the Green Deal was adopted is it sort of regained that Monetian spirit, and it managed to address the two consecutive crises that came, the pandemic and the first year and a half of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, not to do what it had done previously, i.e. forget its sense of direction, but to double down on it. And I think, sort of to me, this was actually quite incredible because it was not at all a foregone conclusion. It wasn't necessarily that intuitive that if you face a pandemic, what you end up doing is accelerate on a green agenda, right? It could have basically derailed the EU. It did not. That first crisis, as we all know, was basically used to substantiate financially what the Green Deal was all about, through Next Generation EU, pushing forward on a legislative agenda, and in particular the Fit for 55 agenda. Again, sort of, now it seems fairly normal that this was done, but really to sort of think back then, it was not at all, as I said, obvious that the EU was going to stick to the course. Likewise, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which, as we know, is a war that has various dimensions. Of course, it's military, it's economic, it's political, and it's an energy, and has been an energy war. And again, it wasn't at all obvious that when energy security came back to the agenda, and of course, energy security has traditionally been understood in very brown terms, it wasn't at all obvious that the EU would not have derailed, right, from its green agenda, and yet it did not, right? If you take that first year and a half after the war, not only even more money was added onto the green transition through Repower EU, but basically that strategic argument that I was referring to earlier was really substantiated, right? So all of a sudden, actually pursuing the Green Deal made strategic sense precisely because we had to decouple energetically from Russia, and obviously that was a brown decoupling. So, all great, and then what happens? It all goes wrong. Right? It all goes wrong, and it goes wrong in ways that in some respects were predictable. Lika earlier was referring to my Green and Global book. That was a book that was published in 2021. And in that book, the first third of the book is precisely on what ended up happening, right? And what was the story there? The story was European right-wing or Eurosceptic populism, nationalist populism, however you want to define it, basically has been coming and going in ebbs and flows. In a sense, okay, I won't say, okay, I will say this. In a sense, the last European elections were fairly lucky elections because it caught us during a downward trend in that curve. This time round, it's exactly the opposite. Anyway, that was a sort of small bracket there. But what ended up happening during that downward curve is that nationalist populists kind of really needed a new story to tell, yeah? The austerity story wasn't working that well anymore after Next Generation EU. The migration story wasn't working that well after no one was really moving anymore, especially during the pandemic. They really needed to have a new story to tell, and it was fairly obvious already back, sort of as I said, in 2021, or at least it was obvious to me, that given that the transition, we define it as a transition, but in many respects, it's really a revolutionary transition. And what happens in revolutions is that normally you do have winners and losers, or at least potential losers, and those potential losers, as in any process of change, will make their voices heard. So if, on the backdrop of that process of socio-economic change, you have particular political movements and parties that need a new banner, right? They tried it a little bit with the pandemic, with the no-vax movement. It wasn't really a spectacular success. It wasn't a majority sort of movement, right? And so they were looking for something, and, as was the case during the Eurozone crisis with austerity, they latched onto something where there was something real, yeah? So there was a story of socioeconomic inequality. And of course, the mistake that, in retrospect, the EU made in those years, in the years of hype, in the sort of Enlightenment and Monetian years, was that it told a very good story about the endpoint. The green future out there is going to be wonderful. It did not tell a story about the messy journey. And the transition, as we know, by definition, is a messy one. So lacking that narrative for the journey, it basically opened up the space for, as I said, parties and movements that were already looking for a new banner. And again, for them, it was an obvious choice also because through it, particularly after the Green Deal came out, they could not only be anti-climate and populist and all the rest of it, but they could also be Eurosceptic precisely because the EU had chosen this particular topic as being its major priority. Anyway, so here we are in this kind of phase of derailing, and you see it in different, you see it playing out in different ways. Nature preservation being kind of watered down. Agriculture, farmers, blocking sort of cities across European countries, and kind of this is where we are now. Now, let me perhaps end with a slightly more, I wouldn't say positive, because it's not really that positive, but a little bit more upbeat sort of perspective from how can we get back onto the rails? Not necessarily kind of zoom forward, but at least, reverse this process of derailing. So point number one is one has to address what those legitimate concerns are, right? One has to necessarily not just develop a transition narrative, but one has to do something about it. And this, what does it do? It costs money. Now, it's not as if, these were ideas that were completely off the map, yeah? I mean, we do have a Just Transition Fund and we have a Climate Social Fund. How much money has been put onto these things? If you take the most, the richest fund, which is the Climate Social Fund, 86 billion over 7 years. How much did the European Union, or I'm kind of slightly cheating here because I'm actually including in the figure both Norway and the UK. So Europe, yeah, how much did Europe spend in just 1 year at the height of the energy crisis? It spent 900 billion, 1 year. And it is clear that 86 over 7 years is nothing, right? So if we're serious about not providing further, not feeding in further into that nationalist populist dynamic, it is fairly clear that those real concerns need to be addressed. Secondly, obviously, the next 5 years are going to be a story about implementation. So actually, in a sense, it doesn't really matter that the level of ambition is not going to be as high as it was last time round on these particular issues. Yes, it would be great to accelerate further on agriculture, on sort of nature preservation, but I find it, and this connects to, I think, several of the points that Mish was making, assuming he's right, not on Italy. He's not, but we'll get to this. Yeah. But assuming he's right on everything else, i.e. that there isn't going to be this radical surge of the extreme right in Europe, in a sense, yeah, I mean, it will be talked about less in climate terms. You can talk about it in whatever language you want. You want to talk about it in terms of industrial policy? Fine. In terms of competitiveness? Fine. Talk about it in whatever language you want, but so long as the legislation that has already been passed is not reversed, and I don't think that is going to happen, so long as, and we know for a fact that it's the case, to the extent that the US-China competition will continue to be largely, sort of based on the one hand digital technologies, on the other hand green technologies, Europe will necessarily have to do something about it. As I said, it may talk about it in a different language with a different political configuration, but it will necessarily have to drive this forward. And then very final point, which I think is hugely important, and this connects to the broader foreign policy story, it's really what we do about the so-called Global South in these particular terms. Because in truth, what was actually totally missing, I mean, there was a little bit there, here and there, but it was really totally missing in a sense, Green Deal 1.0 was the external dimension. This was an internal project about transforming within the European Union. Very little done or said, and certainly very little money behind what Europe's contribution was going to be vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Now, why is this so important? I think it's so important not just, quote unquote, for this particular reason, not just for climate, energy, etc. reasons. It's also important because we're really facing a moment in which all the principles and values underpinning European foreign policy, Europe's role in the world, are really being hollowed out and eroded. And of course, this is largely a consequence, and perhaps we can get into it later, of the Middle East. I mean, it's fairly obvious. However, there is also one point, and it's a sort of conceptual policy point, which I think is really difficult to untangle. How is it that we used to do values in the world? We used to do values in the world by basically, in our trade policies, in our development policies, and whatever it is that we did, we had, for instance, policies of conditionality, right? And so we went round, left, right, and center, telling people what to do and basically saying, we're only going to give you a number of goodies if you actually behave in this principled way. Now, that method is not really available anymore. Just very diplomatically put there. Simply because, as we know, the world has changed, there is competition out there. And the problem is that we've woken up to this reality. We've woken up to the reality that we cannot do values like we once did. what has so far our reaction been, well, if we can't do values like we once did, you know what, we're not going to do them at all. And this is where we are now, right? So we've totally ditched that approach in our relationships with the rest of the world, and of course, in particular, in our relationships with the South. Just think about the migration deals with Tunisia, with Egypt, with Mauritania. These are basically sort of deals that at their essence mean not having a foreign policy at all. When a foreign policy becomes a business deal, I give you some cash and you keep the migrants, that's not foreign policy. I mean, we can call it something else, but it's not foreign policy. Now, why do I connect this back to the argument that I'm making? That it is indeed difficult, because indeed we no longer live in that world, to do values the way we once did. It's difficult to promote a human rights agenda in the way we once did. But however, there are principled issues, and I think climate, we can add health, we can add a number of other things, but let me just take climate because it just follows through with everything else that I've said, actually is the one thing that these countries care about, they are interested in. They need not just our financial support, which they need a lot of, but they also need our investments, they need the technical expertise, they need a lot of engagement. And indeed, it may not be the normative agenda that we once had, but it's obviously fundamentally normative, right? In the same way as it is inside the European Union, it is externally as well. So I would really argue that as, in a sense, Green Deal 1.0 ends, 2.0 will still exist, but it will not be called this way, but it will continue in different shapes and forms. I think it becomes even more important as we move ahead in the next 5 years to put this particular issue, to put climate at the core of our relationships vis-a-vis countries in the global south. Thank you.
So that was the end of goodie bag politics, I guess one would have to say. So no more goodie bags. Many issues we could discuss, and we have to end on Italy, obviously, and Meloni. But could we just start on Middle East, Gaza? Because you kind of, through your exposé, you just mentioned it. Yeah. So how does the rest of the world now perceive us? We have been focusing so much on Ukraine. Now we have Gaza. You have accusation of double standards. How on earth do we tackle this overall situation?
That's very difficult because I ask myself whether we haven't actually gone past the point of no return on this one. And what I mean by this is, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine happened, yes, it's true that we realized that not everyone exactly agreed with us. However, we were solidly part of the global majority. Now, I can't remember the votes at the UN General Assembly, 141, 42, 43, whatever it was, we were solidly part of that majority. Yes, perhaps, in that majority were countries that were not going to sanction Russia and were not going to provide military assistance to Ukraine. So what, They stood, in terms of their position, right? We stood with international law and with a global majority. Now, that situation has obviously totally flipped when it comes to the Middle East, and it's totally flipped in a way in which, not only are we part of a minority, and that minority is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, by sticking to that minority, which is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, we haven't actually, unlike Ukraine, we were solidly united. Here, it is true that the divisions within the EU are changing, but yet we remain totally divided, Whether it's on the recognition of Palestine, whether it's on a permanent ceasefire, whether it's on the approach to the international tribunals, we are divided on each and every one of these points. But the reason why I'm so catastrophic on the Middle East is that I say to myself, let's imagine that as of tomorrow morning, you have a united EU position on a ceasefire, on standing up for international law, on a two-state solution. Imagine if we could go back. I was rereading, actually, a council conclusions from December 1999. And there was these 3 paragraphs on what the EU's position what was on the Middle East, and it was really detailing what a two-state solution was. Imagine if we could agree on something like that again. Okay.
24 hours, we agree.
Impossible. But even if that were to happen, I don't know whether the damage done by now in terms of our reputation and credibility is past the point of no return. If we were to, again, unite on a principal position as of tomorrow morning, what exactly would the message be? The 36,000 deaths, they were fine for us, no problem. Once you start getting closer to 37,000, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. So we've just messed up in such a colossal way that I'm not arguing here that we shouldn't be doing the right thing. Of course we should, but I'm just not sure whether it's going to be sufficient to repair the damage done.
And the linkage to our possibilities then of pushing our agenda with regards to Ukraine at the global level is obviously then...
Yeah, and it is and I think this connects to the broader global picture. Yeah, I mean, because it's not as if sort of other countries agreed with us necessarily in the past, but if one is to be really cynical about it, it didn't really matter that much, right? I mean, it goes back to that citation right at the beginning that we were living in a world in which, we weren't necessarily leaders of that world, yeah? We were kind of friends of the leader, right? But there was only one leader, right?
We'll get back to that as well.
And the world, what did I mean when I said the world was moving in our direction? Sort of norms like multilateralism, international law, integration, regional cooperation. I mean, the sort of bread and butter of the European Union were the global norms. Everyone wanted to become like us, right? Now they don't. And so the voices of the others who don't want to be like us, who don't actually like us, they never really did, yeah? They matter more. And so they matter, and they're being expressed now in the Middle East, but they matter on Ukraine in a way in which 20 years ago, it wouldn't have mattered that much, yeah, if we were in that minority. Now it does.
I want to go back to your overall point about the green transition. You have also sort of coined the expression green lash. But when I listened to your talk, it was almost as if this wouldn't really have big sort of consequences for the next sort of time, with the next period of the European Commission, next European Parliament. But we do still have to agree upon a number of things. I mean, new sort of reduction target, 2040, many other things. So it sounded as if it wasn't really that an important development with the green lash.
I mean, I don't want to...
Now that you're in Denmark, green energy and so forth.
I mean, you're absolutely right. As I said, it would be great if we came up with, ambitious 2040 targets, if we move forward on, sort of decarbonizing the agriculture sector, if we moved on to nature conservation in a far more ambitious way. Of course, it would be great. However, the only point I was trying to make here is that even if we don't do these things, and we simply do what we have already agreed to do, that's not, you wouldn't give it a sort of, 90% mark, but you would still give it maybe a 65, 70, right? So what I'm trying to say is not going to necessarily roll us back. And if one is to be totally honest, why is it that on things like agriculture and nature, we got stuck? Why is it that these were not the things that we started off with? We started off with the easy stuff, right? And it was obvious that this was going to become
energy efficiency or what?
I would put it in these terms. We started off on those issues where there is actually a very strong business case in favor. And so it was not just a political push, it was an economic push, it was a business push, yeah? There's, of course, there are also businesses and stakeholders that were pushing against, yeah? But in the battle, we were, in a sense, we weren't alone, right? Now, you don't have a lot of strong business interests in favor of preserving nature. You don't have a lot of business interests in favor of sustainable agriculture. The forces against have always been much stronger than the forces in favor. But this was the case even, it hasn't become true today. It was the case in 2019 as well. So we just simply push the problem forward.
And that's what we have to deal with now then, obviously.
We have to deal with now. I'm not very optimistic.
Oh, we can see
with
that,
this,
sense
even
that.
if it's not a radically more right-leaning EU, if it's even a slightly more right-leaning EU, which is it is likely to be, I'm not optimistic. But that lack of optimism does not necessarily translate in a catastrophic pessimism, saying, oh, therefore we're going to roll back on everything that we've done. No.
Okay. And before we end, we need to have the master class on Meloni and Italy. So we just heard from Mitch. So where was he wrong?
He was very wrong.
No coffee for him, yeah, okay.
No, I think he was wrong only on one point.
Okay, good, yeah.
And the one point is that the assumption that he was making is that given that Meloni wants to remain a majority figure within Italy, she needs to moderate externally. That is not what Italian politics has looked like in the last years, right? In fact, Meloni is not that popular. She's far less popular than others before her. 2019 elections, the Lega, member of the ID group, got 36% in the European Parliament elections. Meloni is going to be very lucky if she gets, my prediction is about 28, let's say 29. She's trying to play it low at 26, yeah? 26 to 36, that's a 10-point gap, yeah? And Salvini didn't get that 36% by playing a centrist, right? The Five-Star Movement, 40%, right? So it is something, there's something about Italian politics where Mish's argument kind of breaks down. Now, he is also right, though, on one point, which is, well, that doesn't, she's not going to do anything particularly stupid on the economy. True. But these others that I mentioned earlier, Salvini, Five-Star Movement, they didn't do anything particularly stupid on the economy, and yet we wouldn't define them as moderates or centrists as a result. The reason why in Italy people don't do stupid things with the economy is that no one actually does anything, yeah? Okay. Because, getting stuff done through bureaucracy in Italy is not an easy thing. And that is, on the one hand, sort of what saves us when we have really bad politics like we have now. It's also what prevents us from really making big steps forward when we have not good politics, we never have that, but when we have good technocrats that come to save the country when politics is disastrous, like Mario Draghi. He was unfortunately not able to do anything particularly relevant on the economy. So, broadly speaking, I agree with many of the points that he was making, but she is already showing her colors, not only in the points that Mish was rightly mentioning, the constitutional reform, the personality cult. This is another important one, yeah? I mean, when I'm on my scooter in Rome and, you're in the middle of traffic, the heat, and then you stop in front of a bus, yeah, with her big face on it saying, vote Giorgia, yeah? Not vote Meloni, vote Giorgia.
What happens then?
Well, there's something about, sort of eliminating the role of institutions, even of the party. This is about a personality cult. It's, I am a woman of the people. Yeah, call me Giorgia. So there's the personality cult. There's the attempted constitutional reform on the centralization, it's called premierato. Premier in Italy is like the prime minister. Who's the prime minister? So it's about increasing the powers of the prime minister. It's about media freedoms. And it's already about Ukraine. It's already about Ukraine.
In what sense?
Well, as we know these days, yeah, big debate on where is it that weapons can be used. Can they be used to target military targets inside Russia?
Exactly.
And even Scholz, for goodness sake, right, has said, well, maybe, after all, maybe so long as they respect international law, it can be done, yeah?
Vielleicht. Yeah.
Meloni has been adamant, no way. So you already begin to see the way in which she's waiting for the phone call. So, Meloni's support for Ukraine was always variable connected to her relationship with Washington. She needed for everyone, including everyone here, to believe that she was a good Western citizen. What was the way to do it? You know, I mean, she has been more successful than she probably thought herself on pretending she was a good European. She probably, but she thought, okay, maybe I'm not going to be that successful on kind of, you know, pretending to be a Europhile, but I will pretend to be a good Western citizen by doubling down on the relationship with the United States. And how to do this, Ukraine. But of course, if the US changes on Ukraine, and if she already foresees that happening, she's going to change overnight.
And we'll get back to that in the next session. But just a final question. So Meloni and Le Pen, what's going to happen there with that?
Well, you know, they're two prime donne.
Relationship, yes, the queens of Europe.
Yeah. That traditionally did not get on well at all.
Yes.
However, and of course they belong to different families in Parliament. And of course, you know, Le Pen is very closely aligned with Salvini. That is, in a sense, the right, you know, the populist right opposition to Meloni in Italy. However, the two ladies seem to be getting on better these days. And the contacts between them have actually increased quite a bit.
Maybe they don't have that different opinions anyway with regards to Russia and the war.
No, they don't.
As you just indicated.
No, they don't. I mean, the only difference is that one is prime minister and the other is not yet president. But deep down, the views are probably quite similar. Yeah.
I think that's a great sort of linkage to the next session. Thank you very much. And